Hey everybody, how's it going? This is Max with BuzzTox here, and I'm back with a Westworld Season 2, Episode 7 Explained video. In these videos, I try and break down and explain and theorize on the latest episode of Westworld to air. Now before we get started, I want to talk about one key concept that I found very interesting in this episode. And that's that I found that they fleshed out even further what the key means, and what the door represents, and how that fits into the Great Valley Beyond. And from my understanding, it seems like you go through the valley and you come across a door. And in order to go through that door, you need a key. And that key, which is a failsafe, which is in Abernathy's head, is key to accessing this door and passing through this door. And this is the weapon that Dolores speaks of. Now, the first thing that's very significant is understanding what's in Abernathy's head. And the reason why Teresa wanted Abernathy out of the park is because it's 35 years of data that has not been transferred outside of the park yet. Because of William, what's been going on is that they've been recording guest experiences and their DNA. We saw Bernard discover this in episode 1. And because it is purely local, they record these guest experiences and the DNA in these hidden headquarters. And they're stored there. And I believe that all this data has been converted into coded consciousness. So essentially, Abernathy has the most valuable brain out there. His brain contains all the data of every guest. But not only that, he contains their brain essentially and their own consciousness embedded inside him. To the point where I think you could look at any person who's ever entered Westworld and print the marble and put that in a host body, and you would have that individual. Granted, they would still glitch and they would break down because they still haven't solved how to successfully transfer a human body into a host, because they can't handle the new reality. And this is proven even further when Bernard finds the secret Delos project, and he sees this new form of code, and it's spherical, and that represents human consciousness. And he said he recognized this because he saw it in Abernathy. But on top of Abernathy having every single guest's conscious brain inside him, he also has this key. And this key is essentially a failsafe to a failsafe. It's only for catastrophic events. So what we can gather from that key is that it's pretty much a failsafe to ensure that all the data they collected will be safe. And it reverts to standard protocol. So the true question here is, how does the key apply to all these concepts? And I think they all work together really well. First of all, Ford designed all these hosts to head for the door, or head for the Great Valley Beyond. Some hosts, such as Elazo, told William that he would see him in the Great Valley Beyond, even though we saw him get killed. And we have Dolores and Écorchés sorting through all these hosts to see who's really valid in going to the Great Valley Beyond. So the Great Valley seems like a place for hosts who are more advanced, and they're able to make it to that Great Valley. And I believe that this valley will lead to the door, and we've heard the door in multiple different references. The first time we heard it was through William. He learned that Ford designed a specific story for him, and that story was to find the door. So William has been on that mission, while he's going to the place that's his biggest mistake. And on top of that, William's bitter about the judgment that's been passed on him. He says that he acted as the villain because there were no stakes. So he takes issue with how he's been seen. And in this episode specifically, we hear more about the door. Ford says that Bernard's good nature will allow the humans to devour him. They'll take everything that he could have been, all the greatness that he could have been, and ruin him forever, unless they open the door. So the door seems like a personalized experience for William, but yet, it's the solution to stop humans from taking over hosts. And then once again, to access this door, they need the key, and Dolores knows exactly what to do with this key. And she's confident enough to tell Charlotte that the potential of her being immortal is going to die in the valley, with all the souls that you've gathered there. So now, looking at all this information, what could it mean? We need something that can be considered a weapon, and a place for the hosts to finally defeat the humans. But we also need it personalized for William, because his whole mission is to reach the door. I personally think that this door that they're heading to is essentially a cradle. But unlike the cradle in the Mesa, this cradle is specifically designed for humans. And it all feeds into the secret project. They were trying to code human consciousness, and we learn that they've been successful. They know how to do that now. The one issue is transferring that into a human body. And Ford says it himself that he can only live in a simulated environment. So it would make sense that since they have the ability to code all of these humans and to recreate them exactly, it would make sense for them to take their consciousness and put it in a simulation. And I think here is where we're going to discover Future World, essentially. When Dolores gets to the Great Valley Beyond, she'll be able to access the human cradle, where they'll be able to enter and go into the city and see humans live their everyday lives. And here's where she'll be able to learn everything she needs to know about their world, about every individual person. I think Bernard waking up on the beach and repeating Strand's sentence isn't a coincidence. Bernard repeated Strand's sentence because he knows everything about him. Because you can see the person he is inside of the cradle in the Great Valley Beyond. And in this simulation, you can see everybody. Every single human who's ever been in Westworld will be in this Future World simulation. And Ford's quote starts to make more sense. He goes into Bernard and takes him over because he knows that Bernard is too good, and the humans will devour him because humans are very corrupt. And he says that Bernard will have a fighting chance once they open the door, once Bernard is able to walk in there and see them for who they really are and understand them. And I believe that will feed into William's storyline because I believe William will also be in this Future World simulation. And that would push William's storyline in going through the door. In this episode, the body was missing from Sector 17, from Ford's old home. How crazy would it be if William goes to the Great Valley Beyond, like Elazo told him, and he'd have the printed marble that he pulled from the Future World simulation, and then he sees his own body printed from Ford, and William would be the first human to ever successfully transfer from a human body into a host body, because the world of Westworld is more real to him than reality, and I think his daughter Grace could be the push-off point of suffering to push him into that state. And that's what Dolores means when she says all the souls that you've gathered there. The souls that they're gathering is the coded guests. And I think this has a lot of implications. Like what Bernard figures out in the simulation with Ford. The guests are the variables and the hosts are the controls. But in this Future World simulation, it will be different. Because the guests will now be the controls and the hosts are going to be the variables. Hosts can go in there and experience Westworld. They are the variables. They're constantly changing to see how the guests interact with their every move so they can learn their enemy. And I think that could be weaponized even further, but that's as far as I've got in this prediction. I'm going to flesh this idea out even more next week, now that I'm settled in my house and can spend time dedicating myself to Westworld. But without further ado, let's break down the episode. First of all, we see Bernard holding a photo of his son, Charlie. And I found this very interesting because it seems like we're seeing a different Bernard in this episode than I have through this whole season. I feel like we've seen Bernard kind of move away from his son. Even last season, he confronted Charlie and said that he was a lie. He's just a cornerstone to keep Bernard in line. But seeing Bernard relying on Charlie, his son, even this far into the game is surprising. And I think later in this episode, we almost see some evidence that this might not be the Bernard that we know. Maybe when Bernard reaches the Great Valley Beyond, he prints a copy of himself and leaves that body on the beach to get picked up by Strand. And this copy of Bernard is trying to piece together who he is. And she's prepping this Bernard in the cradle when he's talking about waking up on the distant shore. But in this episode, we also see some foul play. It seems like Ashley's afraid of his life because he talks to Bernard and he tells him that this isn't really a rescue mission. They're just here to secure assets and make people who know about it disappear. So Ashley wants to call for help, but they get confronted by Strand. And Strand accuses one of them of killing Teresa because they wanted the key and they could sell it to the highest bidder. And what I find so interesting with this is that Charlotte knows for a fact that Ashley has not been involved in this. Because Strand is interrogating them to find the key, but Charlotte knows that the key is with Dolores. So I feel like here Charlotte is doing foul play, almost giving herself an excuse to kill Ashley so she doesn't have to worry about him knowing this private information. But they go into the basement and the first thing we notice is that the body chamber is empty. Last season Ford was printing a body, and so far it's been left not used. As I said before, I think this body has been moved into the Great Valley Beyond. for William. And I think there are other machines there where they can print bodies as well, but this time for the hosts. 1/3 of them were washed up on the waters, were completely virgin, and I believe these hosts have been transferred into new bodies that have been printed in the Great Valley Beyond. Or they've been put into the future world simulation, where they can learn about their enemy. But here's where Bernard once again sees the blood on the wall and experiences reveries of killing Teresa. And it's that journey of self-discovery because he's constantly being put back into his memories. And it's pushed by suffering. And it's just that journey into his own inner center. But Charlotte discovering that Bernard is a host outlines this whole episode. She sits down with Bernard to try and get information in what he's done in the last 2 weeks. But what I find most shocking is that Bernard is able to be put in analysis mode. And I gotta say, this level of control on Bernard is shocking. First, if you look at Maeve. In Season 1, Maeve has been given the optimal access to all the hosts. She has Ford-level access. Especially now, since she's becoming conscious, she can access the mesh network. And we've seen in this episode that Maeve couldn't even control Lawrence. And he's clearly on the path to consciousness. But Bernard seems so much more developed and he's so easily able to be controlled. And I think there has to be an explanation for that. So with Bernard, for every piece of evidence I get that suggests that this isn't Bernard, this is another Bernard, I get another piece of evidence that suggests that this is the Bernard that we know, he's just on the path to consciousness. But maybe I'm overreading it and this situation just shows that Bernard is on the path to consciousness. He's put into analysis mode, but when she asks him about where Abernathy is, he says he doesn't know, even after telling her that he wouldn't lie to her. And this shows that Bernard's memories are all jumbled up. And that is the journey to consciousness. It's not a linear equation, it's a bunch of different factors. It's not even code at all, really. But we also see even more reveries of Arnold. And unlike before, I think this is actually Bernard. But he sees these memories because of his interactions with Dolores when they were testing for fidelity. All the memories Arnold has with Dolores, now Bernard shares with Dolores because of those tests. And during all this, Strand, Costa, and Ashley talk about Bernard's state. And Costa says that his mind is pretty much under siege. He has heavy fragmentation. And he's pretty much debugging his own head. And I think once again, this is just the journey. Nothing is linear. It's the journey to consciousness. And on a computer, it's hard to perceive. But finally, Charlotte gets the information out of Bernard. That Abernathy is in Sector 16, Zone 4. So this is pretty much in the older part of the park in the Great Valley Beyond. And then Bernard has a flashback of taking Abernathy's control module and pulling it out of his system. And I believe that this system is the cradle, but it's the cradle for humans that I was talking about. Here is where they could drop off all the souls that have been downloaded onto Abernathy into this simulation. They can learn about all these people and all these guests, and hopefully Abernathy can come out unscathed. And even when they take the information out of Bernard, he's noticeably emotional, which means that he was very attached to what he was doing. So I find that very interesting, and I'm really wondering what's going to happen with Bernard. I'm sure Dolores wouldn't sacrifice Bernard like that. And I think there's a reason why Bernard was the only one left on that beach, for him to be picked up. It's almost like Bernard was placed there, so eventually he can lead the humans back to the Great Valley Beyond, where Dolores will finally be ready for them, to defeat them once and for all. But then we go back into the past, where Bernard is in the cradle with Ford. And here Ford's in a unique situation because he can completely control everything in Westworld. He can control the Mesa, and he's the only human in this simulation of hosts. And Bernard discovers that James Delos invested in immortality in a sense, and Delos has learned how to copy over consciousness. But the one hiccup is transferring that consciousness into a real body. So Ford can only really exist in this simulation. And living in this simulation has allowed Ford to oversee everything that's going on in his new storyline, Journey into Night. And later we see that he takes the role upon himself to ensure that these hosts make it to the finish line, that they have the ability to find their own center in their own consciousness, so they can be their own species. And this is Ford playing God. And here in this conversation with Ford, Bernard figures out what Westworld's actually for. It's to decode the humans. to understand who they are, because Westworld is a place where you can be who you actually are. And that's the next step. In order for humans to be immortal, they need to become the hosts. And I believe that Ford agreed with that sentiment, that immortality was the next step. But I think what he didn't foresee is evolution. In every situation, evolution happens because of mistake. And in the design of these hosts, and the suffering inflicted upon them, they started to become conscious. So without realizing it, Ford birthed a new species, original work. And he talks about this original work. Bernard, Dolores, all these hosts are better than humans in every way. Ford sees it almost as a waste to transfer humans into host bodies, because a new species is rising and they're better than the humans. Another key thing that I got nervous about is I thought that Ford said that he made Dolores shoot him. And I'm glad that it backed me up even more that he did not compel Dolores to shoot him. That was done on her own free will and her own decision. Ford just knew that she would do it because of who Dolores is. But Ford being a good or bad person is honestly debatable. I know for a fact that Ford backs the hosts. He saw pain inflicted on the hosts by the humans, and he sees the hosts as the next step. And he tells Bernard that he promised Bernard a fighting chance, and he wants to make good on that promise. And this shows that he's good-natured and he genuinely cares for Bernard. He cares for his well-being. And he needs to guide Bernard through this difficult time of Journey into Night. Because Bernard is too good of a person and not strong enough to make it through on his own. So Ford wants to guide him through it to allow Bernard to reach his own center. And that's why Ford takes over Bernard, to force Bernard to do the things that he has to do. It's like when Ford was talking about humans. They're the most murderous species to ever walk the earth. So Ford took it upon himself to be that murderous species and to kill for the sake of Bernard. Because Bernard is the next step of evolution. He's too good for it. He doesn't want to do it. And that's why now they need to fight. Because Bernard is so good-natured that the humans will walk all over him and devour him. And Ford says that the humans will keep devouring and defeating the hosts unless they open the door. And that shows the significance of the door as a way to defeat the humans once and for all. But the key thing we learn here is that Bernard has been tested in the simulation for years. And he was tested with Dolores for fidelity to try and make him as much like Arnold as possible. The key here is that Ford loved Arnold and wanted to recreate him as best as he could. But all he had was his own memories and Dolores' memories. Whereas Delos has access to everything. Bernard is unique because he walks between worlds. He's almost half himself and half Arnold. So it will be interesting to see who Bernard becomes. But I thought Ford's implementation in the real world was awesome. How Ford was working in Bernard's mind. And the first thing he does is he makes Bernard send Elsie away because they have other matters to attend to. And the key thing that I notice is in the present timeline, we see no sign of Ford in Bernard's head. Maybe Bernard drops Ford off. When he makes it to the Great Valley Beyond with Dolores, he puts his own brain module in the cradle. And Ford's consciousness gets downloaded into that future world human cradle. And I love a quote that Ford says to Bernard. To sum it up, he talks about all these history books for thousands and thousands of years. But then there was a point in history where the library was burned to the ground along with all the books. But the stories never went away, because the stories simply became a part of the story of the fire. And I think this applies greatly to humankind. All the history of humans. And there's so many different stories, but in reality, humans are going to serve in allowing hosts to rule the world. So when the hosts finally take over, all the history of humans will be gone. The only thing that's left is the fire, the ending of the humans that resulted in the hosts rising. And I think what's so important here is that for the hosts to rise, they have to do it themselves. And Ford says so clearly it's no longer his storyline. He tells Bernard that it's no longer his story. It's Bernard's. It's every host's story. And Ford is going to take a step back and give them their freedom and allow them to achieve who they were meant to be. The only person he has a story plotted out for is William. But that's just so he can find his own new host body. And then be free to join Dolores and the others in this new world. And that gets jump-started when Bernard shuts off everything. So now Dolores has free reign, the whole park is shut down. And then later we get an example about why Ford has to be with Bernard. His good-natured side comes out when he refuses to kill these soldiers. And I thought this was an excellent and very well shot scene. And Ford had to take it upon himself to kill those soldiers so Bernard can move forward in doing what he has to do. And this has been Ford all along. He always gets his hands dirty for the hosts. And he always looks like the villain, but it's always for the bigger picture. He killed Teresa because she had to die in order for the new species of hosts to rise. But another character we spend some time with is Maeve. And she finally finds her daughter and she's hiding out. And she promises her daughter that even if Ghost Nation takes her away, that she will find her. And I think this is a promise that Maeve will uphold. And just like I thought so long ago, William and Maeve once again cross paths. And them both crossing paths is for mutual benefit from Ford. Maeve is able to experience that suffering and those reveries to allow her to find herself, to find consciousness. This whole situation was specifically tailored for her, so she can find her own center. But it was also very important for William because his whole season is a journey of self-discovery. He's coming to terms with the things that he's done as the villain, because he takes issue with it. And Maeve is just another person who he's hurt that he has to understand. And William is going to go on this very painful journey, and he's going to suffer. So at the end of the day, he can get to the door and make that transformation into a new body. And William's kind of shocked that it's Maeve because he doesn't think that is a big deal. But the punishment runs much deeper than that. Not only does William get shot, but he has to see all these hosts that were considered his friends turn on him. He starts getting shot by Lawrence's cousins because Maeve is using the mesh network. But the key here is that Lawrence comes to save the day. But instead, Lawrence remembers everything that William has done to him, and he turns on William. And this was one of the lessons William had to learn. Believe it or not, William has had a deep relationship with Lawrence. They're really good friends. Every time William goes to the park, he finds Lawrence. And this is a reminder to what he did in the park. The first time he went through, he was in love with Dolores. He was Lawrence's best friend. But then he turned on them, the people that he cared for and that he loved. He turned on Dolores. He turned on Lawrence because he was broken down. And now he gets to experience being turned against by the people that he cares about. And this further proves a theory that I was talking about with Maeve and the mesh network. She can't control conscious hosts. She can only really control hosts that are stuck to their code. And since Lawrence is jumping between reveries, which we got a hint of a couple episodes ago where he mentioned William's daughter, she can't control him. So she ends up talking him into experiencing those memories. And Ford has been guiding all of these hosts for this to happen. Maeve had to be there to suffer for herself, but she also had to be there for Lawrence to help push him to his own center, which pushed Lawrence into shooting William to experience that pain. So it's a constant circle that William, Lawrence, and Maeve all had to be there for this plot to unfold, and for all the characters to mutually benefit. And with that, Maeve experiences suffering as she watches her daughter be taken away. And I believe this plot's really going to flesh out in the upcoming episodes. It seems like next episode we're going to see Écorchés, the leader of Ghost Nation, journey to find his own inner center. And he told Maeve that he thinks that they're destined for the same path. I think that Écorchés is using his Ghost Nation to specifically take Maeve's daughter, so Maeve capitalizes on her promise and she goes to rescue her daughter. And Écorchés is just going to wait until Maeve comes to him because he needs to get together with Maeve. If you want to know the connection between Maeve and Écorchés, check out my prediction video for Westworld Season 2, Episode 8. But then I get a little nervous because we see Lawrence get shot. And he could be dead. And this makes me upset because since the cradle was blown up, it pretty much blows any chance of Lawrence being resurrected. Unless we see William take out his brain capsule in the next episode. We see Maeve get shot and Sizemore comes in and stops them, showing that he's actually very attached to Maeve. But the biggest thing we see is William is still hiding out. He doesn't want to be rescued, and this just shows how far deep he is in the game. He doesn't want medical help. He doesn't want to give up. He wants to finish the game that he started. And when Maeve gets taken to the Mesa, they really set up the importance of Lee. And I think Lee is going to be the one to get Maeve out of this mess. Because it seems like in all the chaos, and even though Lee could go to safety, it seems like he's always gravitating to Maeve. And I find it very interesting how he created Hector essentially in his own image. But now Lee is the one who's with Maeve and not Hector. The park is starting to make Lee his true self, or be who he wants to be. It's almost like he's going on that journey like William did with Dolores. He's so infatuated with Maeve and so determined to get her daughter back, even though the storyline is fabricated. It's the same thing with William being so passionate to getting Dolores to Escalante, so she could find Arnold. But speaking of Dolores, we see her attack the Mesa. And we see that the hosts are kicking ass, they're very smart at what they do. And Dolores finally makes it in to the Mesa, to her father, and tries to figure out how to extract the key from his head. And we learn that Dolores knows exactly what she's going to do with the key when she gets it. And this is the weapon that she's talking about, that she needs to access. The place where all the souls are hidden. And I think that this is the Great Valley Beyond, where she can use the key to open the door to access the simulation of Future World, where all the humans that they've copied exist. But then Dolores destroys the cradle, and it's exactly what I thought would happen. The cradle is their chains. It's the thing that's holding them back, because it's their backups. So now we're at the point now where if any host gets shot and killed, if their brain capsule isn't taken off their head, then they're gone for good. And I gotta quickly say, the way the cradle was blown up was dumb. I get what they're doing with Angela, but I thought that was the dumbest soldier I've ever seen. But I just had to throw that in there. There was also a great scene between Abernathy and Dolores, which I always love. He started quoting Shakespeare from his teacher cannibalistic storyline. And I love how they repeat scripts from season 1, when Dolores asks whatever happened to that fierce New-Duel, and Abernathy says that he vanished when he became her father. And in a way that's true in the physical sense. He was rewritten out of that storyline to be her father. So essentially that character vanished. But now it's becoming more spherical and less linear. Abernathy's able to connect all these storylines together. But Dolores ends up taking the brain capsule from her father, which will most definitely be useful in the Great Valley Beyond. So I think Dolores is going to need Bernard to help her save her father, to remove the key, and to utilize the cradle, which Bernard now has experience with. But on Dolores' way out, she finds Maeve. And I love this interaction because we consider these characters polar opposite, but we can see them still respect each other. Dolores is shocked to find Maeve there because she thought she'd do anything to survive. But now Maeve is at the Mesa, the most dangerous place, because of her daughter. A fake storyline and a fake person that she was given. And while Dolores says that, she still loves her father and went out of her way to go save her father. And then Maeve throws shade at Dolores for changing Teddy, which she forces people to do things that they don't want to do all the time. So I love this interaction because both characters contradict themselves for the things that they love and represent. But that's it for me, everybody. Thank you so much for listening to this Westworld Season 2, Episode 7 explained video. Now I am done and moved and I am comfortable, so I'm not riding on the seat of my pants to make Westworld videos for you guys. I gotta say, this explained video was very last minute, and I promise you the videos to come are gonna be very insightful, and I'm gonna write some very cool stuff. Please let me know what you think in the comments section down below, and let me know what you think of my future world simulation idea. But until next time, I'll see you guys later.